August 28, 1944, a dusty roadside east of the Seine. The air smells like hot metal, diesel fumes, and cut hay, but something is wrong. The sound is gone. You're standing near an M4 Sherman tank, part of Patton's legendary Third Army. It's not burning. It hasn't been hit by an 88. It's silent. A young corporal, his face caked in pale French dust, hops down from the commander's hatch and kicks the track in frustration. He doesn't need to check the gauge. He already knows. The tank is out of gas, and so is the one behind it and the one behind that. Welcome to the invisible front, where every statistic tells a story, and every empty gaskin holds a whisper from a world at war. Ever wonder what it truly felt like to watch the most powerful army in the world grind to a halt, not from a lack of courage, but a lack of gasoline? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you find the journey we're about to take is a valuable one. Invite viewers to share where they are watching from and which invisible piece of technology or logistics fascinates them the most. Now, let's pull back the curtain and uncover the story of the systems that win wars. You can almost feel the phantom momentum. Just weeks ago, you were trapped in the brutal, claustrophobic hedgerow country of Normandy. Then, on July the 25th, Operation Cobra ripped a hole in the German lines, and the breakout began. It was a flood. You see the maps in your mind's eye. Patton's Third Army, the teeth of the Allied spearhead, hooking east and north, covering hundreds of miles in a blur of liberation. The speed is intoxicating, a dizzying rush of cheering crowds in newly freed French towns. You're not just winning the war, you're racing through it. You're going to be home by Christmas. But now, that race has stopped. The silence of that Sherman tank on the roadside is spreading. The spearhead has outrun its own shadow. You pull back from the front line, back to the frantic planning rooms at SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters. You look at the maps not as a soldier, but as a G4, a logistics officer. And what you see makes your blood run cold. The teeth are 300 miles from the tail. The tail is still back on the beaches of Normandy, Omaha, and Utah, where you first landed. The great port of Cherbourg, which was supposed to be your main supply hub, was so thoroughly demolished by the retreating Germans that it's practically useless. The other deep-water ports, like Antwerp, are still in enemy hands. This means every single thing your army needs to fight must be hauled from those beaches. Every bullet, every K-ration, every plasma bottle, and, most critically, every single drop of gasoline. You stare at the consumption figures, and the numbers are staggering. A single armored division, just one, burns through 350,000 gallons of fuel per day when it's on the move, and you have multiple armies moving. The Third Army alone is screaming for 400,000 gallons daily, but the system, a loose collection of truck companies trying to navigate shattered French roads, can barely deliver a fraction of that. The entire Allied advance is drinking from a logistical straw. This is the great paradox of August 1944. You have an enemy who is broken, retreating, and disorganized. You have the momentum, the morale, and the material. But the material is in the wrong place. General Patton is apoplectic, demanding gas to continue his push to the German border. But you can't just wish fuel into existence. The entire strategy of the war, the broad front advance favored by Eisenhower, is about to collapse. This isn't just a supply problem. It's a crisis that threatens the entire war effort. The Germans are being given the one thing they desperately need: time. Time to regroup at the Siegfried Line. Time to dig in, to rearm, to prepare for the winter. The halt is giving the Wehrmacht a breath of life. You've created a logistical vacuum, and the silence of those tanks is the sound of that vacuum about to implode. You are back in the planning rooms miles behind the front, but the tension is just as thick. The air is stale, full of cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. You're watching colonels and majors, men whose names will never be in the history books, poring over maps, their faces grim. The problem seems unsolvable. The iron heart of military logistics, the railway, is dead. The retreating Germans, in a final act of spiteful genius, have systematically destroyed the French rail network. They've not only bombed bridges and torn up track, but they've also taken the specialized railway guns, tools designed to methodically destroy every single railroad tie, and use them with devastating efficiency. Every single rail line leading from Normandy to the front is a useless ribbon of shattered wood and twisted steel. Rebuilding it would take 6 months. You have 6 days, at best, before the entire Allied army seizes up. This is where the old rulebook is thrown out. You see a G4 officer, lean and exhausted, stab a finger at the map. He's not pointing at the railways, he's pointing at the roads, the MSRs, the main supply routes. To a 1944 logistician, roads are for short-haul last-mile delivery, from a railhead to the troops. They are not for strategic long-haul supply. They're slow, they get congested, they're vulnerable, and the trucks to run them break down. But right now, they are all you have. An idea forms, born of pure, unadulterated desperation. It's an idea so audacious, it borders on madness. What if? What if you treat the roads like a railway? Not just a road network, but a system. A dedicated, high-speed, non-stop, one-way conveyor belt made of asphalt and rubber. In just 72 hours, the plan is created. It is a masterpiece of hurried genius. You watch them draw the lines on the map. 2 main routes are designated, forming a gigantic loop. One, the northern route, will be for going, a solid, unbroken column of trucks heading east, loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food. The other, the southern route, will be for coming back, an equally unbroken column of empty trucks heading west to reload. This is the non-negotiable core of the plan, the one-way rule. To maintain speed, no one is allowed to stop, no one is allowed to pass, no civilian traffic is permitted, no other military traffic, not even a general's jeep, is allowed to interfere with the flow. The roads are sterilized, belonging only to the trucks, and it will be 24/7. The trucks will never stop. They will run day and night, through rain, through darkness, through the lingering threat of the Luftwaffe. This isn't just a convoy, it's a perpetual motion machine of supply. They need a name for it, something to tell the military police, the engineers, the drivers, that this is the single most important priority in the European theater. They borrow a term from the railroads back home. In the old days, when a freight car needed to be expedited, it was marked with a big red circle, a red ball. The yardmasters and engineers knew that red ball freight took priority over everything, even passenger trains. This will be the Red Ball Express. The order is given. On August 25, 1944, just as the crisis reaches its absolute peak, the Express is born. The call goes out for every available truck, every available driver. They are about to attempt the impossible, to sustain the largest land offensive in history using nothing but the internal combustion engine, grit, and a 400-mile loop of shattered French road. The great gamble has begun. The plan is on the map, but the map doesn't move. A system is just an idea until you give it a body. And now you see it, the true unsung hero of this entire operation. It's not a general. It's not a tank. It's a truck. You're standing on the wet sand of Utah Beach, and the air is filled with the growl of its engine. This is the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 666. To the GIs who will spend the rest of their war in its cab, it's just the deuce-and-a-half. It is, without exaggeration, the most important vehicle of the Second World War. Hollywood got this part wrong. The glory didn't just belong to the Sherman or the P-51, it belonged to this. It's not pretty. It's a box on wheels, painted a dull olive drab. It's noisy, its engine a rough, throaty roar. The cab is Spartan, a hard metal bench seat, a big steering wheel with no power steering, and a set of simple gauges. But you're not looking at a single truck. You're looking at an idea. This is the good enough philosophy of the American arsenal made steel. While German engineers were famous for their over-engineered, complex, and beautiful machines, their Tigers, their Panthers, American industry was doing something far more revolutionary. It was standardizing. The deuce-and-a-half wasn't the fastest truck in the world. It wasn't the most comfortable. It didn't have the most advanced features. But it had three things that made it a war winner. It was reliable, it was mass-produced, and it was simple to fix. You look at the numbers, and they make your head spin. By the end of the war, General Motors will have built over 800,000 of these trucks in all their variants. You compare this to the German effort. The Wehrmacht entered the war with a fragmented mess of over 100 different truck models, all captured or requisitioned from civilian factories across Europe. A German mechanic at the front was a nightmare of mismatched parts, trying to fix a French Renault with parts from a Czech Skoda. But an American mechanic? He only needed one set of tools, one set of parts, one manual. The truck you're looking at in Normandy uses the exact same parts as the one rolling through the jungles of Burma or the mud of Italy. This is the real secret. It's a 6x6. All 6 of its wheels can be driven by the engine. This isn't just a truck, it's an all-terrain beast. When the paved roads shattered by bombs and retreating Germans turn to mud, the deuce-and-a-half just engages its front axle, sinks its 10 heavy-duty tires into the muck, and pulls. It can haul 5,000 pounds of cargo through terrain that would strand a normal vehicle. This is the workhorse of the system. The Red Ball Express, that brilliant idea of a one-way highway, would have been a complete failure with any other vehicle. It relied on a machine that could be loaded to its breaking point, driven by a tired soldier for 400 miles, handed off to another driver, and just keep going. It was a good enough tool that, when multiplied by the hundreds of thousands, became a perfect strategic weapon. It didn't win the war by being a better tank. It won the war by making sure the actual tanks never had to stop. The Red Ball Express is about to send 6,000 of these trucks bumper to bumper in a continuous loop. It's a river of steel, and the deuce-and-a-half is the water molecule. It's the true face of the invisible front, a rolling testament to the idea that the power to supply a war is the power to win it. You have the plan, the one-way loop. You have the machine, the 6,000 deuce-and-a-halves. Now you need the most critical component, the men. This is where the story of the Red Ball Express becomes more than just a logistical triumph. It becomes a story of a deep, painful, and profound American paradox. You're back at headquarters, but this time you're looking at personnel rosters. The math is simple and brutal. To run 6,000 trucks 24 hours a day, you don't just need 6,000 drivers. You need at least 2 drivers per truck to run in shifts, and ideally a third for relief and rotation. That's a minimum of 12,000 men, and a more realistic number is closer to 18,000, who must be found immediately. They can't be trained from scratch. They must be pulled from existing units right now. The call goes out. Send us every driver you have, every truck company that isn't nailed down. And as the units begin to arrive, you see the reality of the 1944 United States Army. It is a racially segregated force. This isn't a subtle policy, it's a rigid, official doctrine. The U.S. Army believes, as an institution, that black and white soldiers should not serve, eat, or sleep in the same units. But the segregation goes deeper than just separate barracks. It's a segregation of opportunity. You see, the Army's leadership, reflecting the ingrained racism of the era, held a deeply prejudiced view that African American soldiers were not suited for the complexities or pressures of frontline combat. They were stereotyped as being better suited for labor and service. So, while talented and patriotic black men who enlisted or were drafted were often barred from the infantry, the armor, or the artillery, they were funneled by the tens of thousands into the Quartermaster Corps, the Transportation Corps, and the Engineer Battalions. They were the men who built the roads, unloaded the ships, and critically, drove the trucks. And now, in the midst of a crisis, this systemic racist policy has an unintended consequence that is about to save the entire Allied campaign. The logistics officers, desperate for drivers, don't care about the color of a man's skin. They care about his MOS, his military occupational specialty. They need driver 2.5-ton truck. And when they look at their rosters to see who has that specialty, who has the training, who is already organized into quartermaster truck companies, you see the pattern immediately. The vast majority of the men available for this critical mission are African American. This is the 75% paradox. The Red Ball Express, the most vital logistical artery of the war, will be run by men who are fighting for a freedom abroad that they are systematically denied at home. Nearly 3/4 of the drivers who will climb into the cabs of those deuce-and-a-halfs are black. You see them arriving, their units hastily reassigned. They are being asked to be the saviors of an army that makes them eat in separate mess halls and sleep in separate tents. They are being handed a task that is anything but safe, rear echelon work. These roads are not secure. They are driving through territory that was in enemy hands just days before. They will face strafing runs from the skeletal remains of the Luftwaffe. They will hit mines planted on the shoulders of the road. They will dodge sniper fire from German stay-behind units. They will do this all while being told by the very system they are saving that they are not good enough for combat. The irony is staggering. The Army, in its attempt to segregate, had accidentally created the largest and most experienced pool of military drivers in the world, and now it had no choice but to use them. The invisible front had just found its invisible army. It's Oro 300 hours, somewhere south of Paris. You are gripping the wheel of a deuce-and-a-half, and your eyes feel like they're full of sand. The engine's roar is no longer a sound. It's a physical vibration that has soaked into your bones. You've been driving for 22 hours. Your co-driver is asleep, his head bouncing against the metal door. You bite down, hard, just to feel something. In the dim glow of the dashboard, you see the speedometer needle hovering at 45. You've illegally bypassed the truck's governor, the 35-mile speed limiter, because speed is the only thing that matters. This is the reality of balling the jack, an old railroad term the drivers have adopted for going flat out, and it is the only gear you know. You are one man in a river of 5,958 trucks. This is the system in action, and the metrics are so vast they border on the unbelievable. You're not just part of a convoy, you're part of a 400-mile non-stop loop of grinding steel. At its peak, the Red Ball Express is moving 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. That is not a typo. That is the weight of the Eiffel Tower, delivered every 24 hours. The primary cargo is gasoline. You look at the jerry cans slung on the side of your truck and multiply. The Express is shoving over 1.5 million gallons of fuel to the front daily, feeding the unquenchable thirst of the armored divisions. This is a brutal, high-risk, 24-hour-a-day operation. The plan called for 2 drivers per truck, running in shifts. The reality is that there aren't enough men. You and your partner are a team, but the demand is so high that you'll finish your 400-mile run, drop your cargo of ammunition, and be told to grab a cup of coffee, turn around, and get right back in line for the return trip to the beaches. Sleep is a luxury you can't afford, a thief you fight off with sheer willpower and endless cigarettes. The Red Ball Highway is a sight that defies military logic. It's a solid, unbroken column of olive drab steel stretching from one horizon to the next. The military police line the route, but they're not directing traffic. They are simply there to enforce the flow. No stopping. Ever. If your truck breaks down, you have minutes to get it to the shoulder. If you can't, a massive 6'6" wrecker truck, the Express's guardian angel, will appear out of the gloom, hook you, and physically drag you out of the line so the trucks behind you don't even have to slow down. The danger is constant, and it doesn't just come from the enemy. The roads are a mess. They are the liquid mud and solid dust that coats your throat and grinds in the truck's gears. The engineers have marked the route with simple hand-painted red ball signs, but at night, in the mandatory blackout, it's easy to take a wrong turn, and the enemy is still here. You drive with your cat's eye headlights, tiny slits that throw just enough light to see the tail lights of the truck 60 yards in front of you, but not enough, you pray, to be seen from the air. The Luftwaffe is a shadow, but it's a real one. A random strafing run from a lone Me-109 can turn a gasoline truck into an inferno. The road shoulders are littered with mines the Germans left behind. But the greatest, most persistent killer on the Red Ball Express is exhaustion. The hundreds of trucks you see ditched, overturned in the fields aren't just from combat. They are from men who simply, finally, fell asleep at the wheel for one fatal second. You pull back from the dusty cab of the deuce-and-a-half and cross the front line. You are now behind German lines looking at the Red Ball Express not as a participant, but as a victim. You are a German staff officer, perhaps a major, in an exhausted Panzergrenadier division, and you are trying to make sense of the reports from your reconnaissance units. They are, in a word, insane. Your soldiers, men who have been fighting for 4 years, are reporting an endless column of American trucks, not a convoy that passes in an hour, not a supply run that happens at dawn. They are reporting a solid, unbroken river of steel that runs day and night, 24 hours a day, just miles from the front. They say it is lit up at night, a defiant blaze of headlights, a fiction, but a powerful one, born of the sheer audacity of the operation. You look at your own logistical reality, and the comparison is a bitter joke. Your once mighty Wehrmacht is now a phantom. It is a horse and buggy army in a motorized war. For every 100-liter drum of Treibstoff, fuel, your armies are allocated, they are lucky to receive 10. Your panzer divisions, the terror of 1940, are now immobilized, dug in as static pillboxes, not because of Allied tanks, but because they have no gasoline to move. Your own supply system is a desperate, fragmented mess of requisitioned civilian trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and dwindling rail lines that are being systematically obliterated from the air. This is the psychological defeat. It's what Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, would later describe in his memoirs. The war of production was over. The Wehrmacht wasn't just being outfought, it was being outproduced and outsupplied on a scale that defied the European imagination. You capture an American driver. He is a young black man from a transportation company. His testimony, when translated, is chilling. He speaks not of tactics or strategy, but of systems. He complains about the food, about the long hours, about the rain. He talks about his truck, the deuce-and-a-half, as if it were a common farm tool. He describes a world back across the ocean, a place he calls Detroit, that can produce these machines in the hundreds of thousands. This is the moment the ideological collapse begins. You realize you are not fighting an army, you are fighting a factory. You are fighting an assembly line that stretches 4,000 miles across an ocean, and then, without pause, extends another 400 miles inland as a conveyor belt of trucks. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and his staff see this clearly. Their after-action reports from this period are not just about battles, they are documents of awe and despair. They write about the American material Schlacht, battle of material. They describe an enemy who uses artillery, air power, and supply on a level that is unimaginable. The Red Ball Express is the living, breathing proof of this. It is a motorized nightmare. While a German commander must hoard his last few gallons of fuel for one desperate counterattack, the American commander simply calls for more, and, impossibly, more arrives. This is the invisible industrial arms race that Germany had already lost in 1942 and is only now seeing the consequences of in 1944. The Red Ball Express is not just a logistical solution, it is a weapon of psychological warfare. It is the sound of 1,000 engines telling every German soldier within earshot that their cause is hopeless, that they are facing an industrial giant that can and will simply bury them under a mountain of steel, gasoline, and bullets. The silence of Patton's tanks in late August was a problem of distribution, not of supply. The silence of your own panzers is permanent. The Red Ball Express ran for 83 days. It was born in the desperate crisis of August and died quietly in the cold mists of November 1944. Its end was not a glorious finale, but a simple logistical transition. You're standing on a wharf in Antwerp, Belgium. The port, one of the largest in the world, is finally in Allied hands and operational. You hear the groan of cranes lifting entire railway cars and Sherman tanks from the holds of Liberty ships. The tail has at last caught up with the teeth. Simultaneously, the railway lines, those shattered arteries that had caused the crisis, are alive again. Thousands of engineers, many from African American engineering battalions, have performed a miracle of their own. Working 24/7, they have rebuilt the bridges, laid new track, and cleared the tunnels. The first trains are now chugging their way from the coast, carrying 10 times the tonnage of a truck convoy for a fraction of the fuel. The Red Ball Express is no longer needed. The order is given, and the system is shut down. The one-way routes are opened again to all traffic. The Red Ball signs are taken down from the crossroads. The great roaring river of steel and gasoline simply stops. You look at the final tally, and the numbers are a monument. In its 83-day life, the Express has moved over 412,000 tons of supplies. It delivered the fuel that restarted Patton's tanks. It delivered the ammunition for the fall offensive. It delivered the food and winter clothing that kept the Army alive. It had, by every conceivable measure, worked. It was the ugly, desperate, brilliant stopgap that saved the entire Allied advance and ensured the war would not drag on for another year. It was a victory. But then you see the silence. The 18,000 men, the 75% of them African American, who drove themselves to the point of collapse. What happens to them? There are no parades. There are no mass medal ceremonies. Their truck companies are simply dissolved and reassigned. They go back to being just truck drivers, just laborers, just quartermaster troops. They have been the lifeblood of the Allied Army, the most critical link in the entire chain, and now they are invisible again. This is the great quiet tragedy of the Red Ball Express. Its legacy was buried not by the enemy, but by indifference and by the prejudice of its own time. These men were not seen as heroes. They were seen as service troops, performing their assigned labor. The story of the Express was a story of logistics, not of glorious combat, so it was filed away in after-action reports. And the story of its African American drivers was shuffled to the very back of that file. They had saved the advance, but they returned to a segregated army that still viewed them as second-class citizens, and soon to a country that would deny them the very freedoms they had just secured for Europe. They had been the indispensable men, and in the moment the crisis passed, they became expendable once more. And so the curtain falls on the Red Ball Express. The roar of 6,000 engines fades, replaced by the silence of history. But if you stand quietly on those same French roads today, you can almost feel the echo of their passing. you're left with the sheer humbling scale of it all. A system built from desperation, run on good-enough machines and fueled by the exhaustion of invisible men that changed the course of the war. This is the legacy of the Invisible Front. It's the realization that wars are not just won by the burst of a shell, but by the turning of a wheel. It's the quiet understanding that the most powerful weapons are often not weapons at all, but the systems that create them, the logistics that feed them, and the overlooked people who, for a few crucial moments in history, become the most important soldiers in the world.